Well, it's my great pleasure this evening to introduce our very distinguished speaker, Dr. Christopher Tuttle. Christopher is an esteemed archaeologist specializing in the Hellenistic and Roman periods of the Middle East and North Africa. He has been executive director of the Council of American Overseas Research Centers and has held many other important positions. Christopher has been leading some extremely popular tours for ASA. He's taken groups to Syria, Jordan, Sicily, Greece, Turkey, and of course he's got some wonderful tours coming up. But tonight he's going to be talking to us about Sardinia, Corsica. And tonight's topic is the Nuragic culture of Sardinia. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Christopher Tuttle to tell us more about Sardinia and its fascinating history.
Thank you, Susanna, and welcome everybody to another one of these two-part lecture series. Tonight, as Susanna mentioned, we're going to really be focusing on the prehistory of Sardinia. We're going to be talking about the Nuragic culture, or Nuragic, variously pronounced depending on your accent. So where we're talking about is, of course, the two islands off the western coast of the Italian boot. So Sardinia is the larger of the two here, and Corsica is the smaller of the two above. Sardinia is owned by Italy, and Corsica is owned by France. So today we'll be talking about Sardinia. But just so you know, of course, it's labeled here as the Tyrrhenian Sea on the eastern side, but it's bordered directly by the Mediterranean on the western side. So the pre-Nuragic chronology is just to give you a little bit of really longue durée history. One of my favorite things about this island is this little fossil being shown to you on your screen. This is the Oreopithecus bambili. It's a small, early, not quite hominid primate from 8.5 million years ago. So it's pretty amazing. And this particular fossil was actually found on the mainland of Italy, but it also is actually the only primate prior to the human lineage that has been found on Sardinia. That being said, 250,000 years ago, there was other hominids on the island, although we just don't know enough about them to know which branch of the evolutionary tree they're from, because we really have one finger bone. Not enough to tell us much. But about 18,000 BC, we have the first of the Homos arriving. So there's been some evidence of Homo erectus, but mostly it seems to be early Homo sapiens sapiens. Then our first prehistoric evidence, other than really your basic stone tools from the really early 18,000 BCE, but our first identifiable culture begins around 6,000 BC. And I'm not going to go through all of these. I've put them on the screen here so you can see. But there are 8 cultures that developed on Sardinia or migrated to Sardinia in the case of the second to the last there, the Bell Beaker culture. But these are the ancestors of the people who would develop the Nuragic culture. And so it spans from about 6,000 BC down to 1600 BC because the Bonanaro culture overlaps directly with what would become the Nuragic material culture that we can identify as a separate cultural entity from the Bonanaro. Those who've heard me speak before know I'm really into maps and chronology because I think it really helps put it into its space in terms of both place and time. So we really begin to have an identifiable Nuragic culture around 1700. A little bit earlier by a couple of centuries, as I mentioned, because the Bonanaro and the Nuragic overlap, and the Nuragic seems to evolve a bit out of the Bonanaro. But let's put a solid number here at 1700 BC. and it spans all the way down to when the Romans take over the island. And I thought it'd be fun to put a little bit of relative to help you put this into a global context. So around 1700 BCE, when Nuragic civilization really starts to be identifiable, is at the same time that the Cycladic culture that I spoke about a couple of lectures ago was beginning to be absorbed into the Minoan culture. At 1650 BCE is when the island of Santorini, or the ancient volcano of Thera, erupts. 1500 BC is when Egypt was at its largest during the New Kingdom under the pharaoh Thutmose I, when they'd actually controlled all the way to the Euphrates. 1400 BC, Scotland's Middle Bronze Age starts. For those who are on the Turquoise Coast, 1330 is approximately when the Uluboron shipwreck went down on the Turquoise Coast, off the coast of Lycia. 1250, Mycenaean tombs appear on mainland Greece. That's important because they're a major influence on the Sardinian Nuragic culture. 1100 BCE, we have the Western European hill forts begin to appear. This, again, also relevant because they have a similarity to the Nuragic towers, the nuraghe, and to the settlements that grew up around them. Are very similar in some ways to the European hill forts. 1000 BCE, Phoenician alphabet is written. And then just for some fun here, we've got 900 BC is when the Olmec culture in Mexico appears. 800 BCE, we've got the Etruscan culture in central Italy. 700 is when Homer writes the Iliad and the Odyssey, approximately. 600 BCE, Pompeii was founded. 500 BCE, Confucius becomes a governor in one of the provinces of China. And 238 BC, Rome captures Sardinia and Corsica, and the Nuragic culture begins to fade away. So that's all what's going on. Well, not all, but a lot of what's going on around the world as this culture is developing and spreading. Okay, so what do we first have that we can say is definitively Nuragic versus some other cultural identity? And it is the tombs. We have megalithic gallery graves are the main category of these tombs, and they're not unique to this culture. We find these throughout all of the megalithic stone cultures of Europe for greater or lesser degrees, but some of the ones in Sardinia are truly monumental when compared to even others that are more well known. So far, we have over 800 of them that have been documented, and I've put a map here on the left to show you the distribution of the tombs. And they fall largely into two types, the slab type and the block type. The example I've put here on the screen for Mores, Sardinia, is one of the monumental slab types. The block types we're going to see a little bit further on as we look at the buildings like the nuraghe towers themselves that are built using smaller cut stones that are laid without mortar in a dry masonry manner. They had very simple burial chambers, rectangular burial chambers, sometimes singular, sometimes multiple burials. There's no real pattern that can be distinguished on that. Not a lot of ancillary chambers. A few have been found in that 800 tombs, but really it is this transition to this type of tomb, the so-called Tomb of the Giants, that came out of those megalithic dolmen-like tombs. And we begin to have this distinctly Sardinian nuragic type of tomb. We call them the Tombs of the Giants or the Giants' Graves. And I've put a composite reconstruction drawing of the general shape on the left-hand side of the screen and an aerial view of one of these at the site of Sidi to give you an idea of what it looks like, even though it's been destroyed. And these are really, really amazing. Like I said, there's been over 800 of these different types of tombs so far documented, and we actually think the number was far greater. I'll talk about why some of them have disappeared in a little bit when I'm talking about some of the towers as well. Just another quick graphic here to give you an idea of the range, but the similarity at the same time. You can see that this is the overall shape. They tend to have this opening, arched, or semicircular structure that leads into the main corridor of the tomb. These are, of course, top plans looking down on the different tombs. And they have a single corridor in them where the burial and the grave goods would have been put. In a few cases, like the second row down, the one on the far right, you can see there's a couple of small chambers in this one right here. We're not 100% sure if they're original or if they might have been a reuse of the tomb at a later date. But these are very distinct nuragic culture, and it is the first type of material culture we have that defines the civilization. Here's just a couple of images from a tomb at Oloi and another one at Ajakena. The one on the right is actually included. I believe we'll see that on the tour. And when you walk across the ground, you get this sense of just how colossal these are. But the plans and stuff don't really show you all that. What I like about the image on the right for the Nuragic tomb is you see all this rubble right here on the ground. That's part, I'm going to back up for a sec. That's part of this part of the tomb right here. And it's a cairn. It's a pile of stones built over the constructed burial section underneath. So they built this with a series of slab stones, these corridors, and then they covered the whole thing over in what essentially is the shape of an upturned boat. So other than the tombs, what people generally think of when they hear of the Nuragic culture are the nuraghe, because that is the word that actually gives us the name of the ancient civilization. We don't know what they called themselves, as usually the case with these early civilizations. They are a Bronze Age civilization. They did eventually have writing, but by the time that was becoming widespread, it was actually in the other historic periods. And so things are talking about the Roman world or the Punic world rather than their own world, which is fading. So we don't know what nuraghe even means. The etymology is very much disputed. There's some argument that it comes from a number of words like nora, nuru, or nuri, which may mean a pile of stones. Another suggestion is a heap of stones with a pit into the earth. Anyways, we don't know. But what we do know is that at present, we know there are over 7,000 of these built around the island of Sardinia. Probably more than 10,000 of them originally. And we say that because we have several places where we have traces. The stones are all gone, but there are traces that there probably was one there in the past. And with both the tombs and the towers, the nuraghe towers, a lot of them were destroyed in the 19th century when there was a series of laws put into place called the enclosure laws. And farmers and landowners were required to enclose all of their property in walls. So people dismantled the tombs, they dismantled the towers and used a lot of that material in building these walls. And it was also at the same time in the late 19th century when the road network was being built, and a lot of these stones were reused in building the roads. So we will probably never know exactly how many there were. But we can break the ones that we know of down into basically two categories. There are the proto-nuraghe, which are the earliest ones going all the way back to that beginning of their culture around 1700 BCE. Then we have the Tholos nuraghe, which are the ones that most people think of. These are the more distinct tower tombs. So we can break those Tholos tombs into three further categories where there's a single tower, then there's the courtyard nuraghe, and then there are what we call the polylobal nuraghe, the ones that have multiple towers, often built into an enclosing wall that goes around the main tower. And we'll see some examples of this as we move forward. The entire concept of the nuraghe towers was turned into a World Heritage listing in 1997 based on the Nuragic site as a type site. So they couldn't make each and every one of these locations a separate World Heritage Site. So they listed the concept of the Nuraghe Towers for the whole of Sardinia. And there have been efforts since to add particular regions to the World Heritage Site as well, but none of those have gone through yet. So the proto-Nuraghe, what are we talking about here? They're very simple in the scheme of things. And I've included this plan here to show just kind of the layout, the top plan, to look down on some of these. And they're different than what we think of when we sail by the island today and we see the towers along the coast or whatnot. These are much shorter. They're rarely higher than 10 meters. They are, whereas the regular towers can be 20 plus meters in height. There's no central chamber in most of them, and you'll notice in these plans that there's a few corridor-like structures, but no central burial chamber. There's no standardization to the layout like we'd have in the later monuments, the ones that begin to appear in like the 15 to 1300 BC range. Sometimes they have multiple corridors rather than just a single corridor, and they cover a huge area. I think the largest one of these proto-Nuraghe covers something like 245 square meters. Its footprint. I mean, that's gigantic. The more typical tower nuraghes are half that or less. So the most important feature of these proto-Nuraghe were probably the terraced tops. And here's an example of one of them. There are not many photos that I've been able to find to show you a range of them, because many of these are really not well preserved. They're overgrown. They're not major tourist sites. So this one is at the Fronte Emola. And you can see at the top there, it's very flat. And this entire footprint of the proto-Nuraghe had these flat terrace tops. And what we think was going on is that is where the residents who resided around these Nuraghe towers, in the cases of the proto-Nuraghe, they were building their structures on top of these towers. So what are the towers? This is very much debated until recent decades. I mean, for literally 200 years or more, people have been debating, were these residents of rulers? Were they purely for defensive purposes or religious purposes? I mean, typical interpretations that archaeologists, especially in the early days, would have. We can say fairly definitively now that they were both defensive and civic in nature. So the ones that have larger spaces inside may have hosted meetings or something for settlement leaders or settlement leadership, or we don't know for certain, but it's a good hypothesis. But we do know now, based on the area surveys that have been done around these monuments, that they very much served a defensive purpose. So that would seem to be their primary goal. The Thalos towers, or the single towers, such as the one shown here, and I believe that might be Kristen standing in the doorway there. These are, you can see the difference between that earlier plan of the proto-Nuraghe and the tower ones. They're far more systematic. They have a central chamber. Most of them do not have multiple corridors. They do have flat tops when the tops are still complete, and they were probably used as lookouts and that sort of function in relation to the defensive aspect of the towers. But nonetheless, there is a pattern to the design, but each one of them has its own particular characteristics, which would probably be determined by the environment in which it was built and what types of stones were available, how much surface area it could cover and was necessary to support its weight, the particular characteristics of that particular community introduces variations. We also always have to bear in mind that some of these are not single period. So when they were built initially, they might have had a simple arrangement with just a central corridor, but over the course of the centuries, they modified them and added other features. And those are all often very difficult to suss out the sequence, especially in some of the ones that you can visit today where there's been reconstruction in the early part of the, or the later part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, and they didn't always mark what they did back then. So by and large, there's variations, and we tend to think of these variations as being regional. Then we have the complex nuragic towers. These are the polylobal, and these overview plans here will show you. They have most frequently 3 different towers creating a trilobal structure, but in some cases it's 4, some cases it's 5. I believe in one case we have 6, but I couldn't find a photograph or a plan to verify that it actually had 6. I think in that case it really actually has 5, and that people have mistaken one of the surrounding wall towers as being part of the nuraghe itself. And this is just a photo of one of the trilobal nuraghe, one of the major sites that's been excavated and you can visit today. And if you look very carefully, you can actually see this curvature of the trilobal structure on this wall here, and here you can see it as well as it curves back around from the point. Really, really, truly impressive constructions. And you'll notice that they are a combination of what essentially are found stones, field boulders, and some that are shaped, and they didn't have the means to support huge weight unless the bases were big. So you'll have the bigger stones and the thicker parts of the walls are at the bottom, and they taper a little bit as they move up toward the top, and you'll see the smaller stones in play there. Inside, some of them have corbelled ceiling, some of them, that's the type of ceiling where the stones overlap to create a full coverage up to a peak. You have some very narrow corridors in them. You can see when you visit the interior of these that they are not very movement friendly and would be very hard to take if somebody was actually, using it for a defensive purpose. So the nuraghe complexes, or the complex nuraghe and their surrounding materials, this is one of the best examples we have of showing the wall that was around the entire complex. You have here in the center, here you have the trilobal nuraghe tower itself. Here you have a curtain, here you have the curtain wall. Here you have a defensive wall with more towers. These are not, they're just defensive towers. They're not nuraghe exactly. But you also have the remnants of some of the settlements that were built right up against the walls of the nuraghe itself. This is very characteristic, and we don't understand why their settlement layouts are so chaotic, and we're going to see a few more of them in a few minutes, and we just don't know. There's never been found a central square like an agora. There does not appear to be any open space for big public meetings or public events in any of the settlements that we've examined. In reality, there's only been a handful, like less than half a dozen, where there's been sufficient excavation to really understand how extensive these might have been. Even this one, for example, it's only been partially excavated. So they may have been much bigger at the time. And this is the biggest one that we know of at Nuragic. And this is, you can see from this plan how convoluted and chaotic the settlement was. So here is the defensive wall around the nuraghe proper. And you can see all of these structures that were built up against and leading to the nuraghe tower itself. But we have literally no open spaces in here. This may look like an open space, it's just unexcavated down here. But up here you can see that it's just one structure connects to another structure, leads to another structure. Sometimes you have to go through one structure to get to another structure. Very, very strange. And just a couple of photographs off here to the right to give you a sense. There's no scale in them. These round circular huts are actually fairly big. I would say on average they're 3 meters, 4 meters across. Some of them bigger, such as this one right here, which is a communal structure, but yeah, no open space. It's kind of unusual. Here's just an example of that large center structure that we just saw in the previous plan, but this is a different site. This is at Palmavera. And I've included this reconstruction of what they look like. This is very similar to earlier Neolithic roundhouses we find all throughout the Mediterranean and East Mediterranean world, where part of the house is subterranean and you have to step down to get into it, and that's where the stone walls are built. And then the superstructure would have been built of wood and reeds and other perishable materials that built it up into a cone shape. The photo here is of we don't know exactly what the purpose of this thing in the center of the room is. This is a meeting hall is what they call it. And there's even a little bench where you can see along the bottom here, not unlike kivas, for example, in the American Southwest. But we don't know what they did in here. We don't know who was in here. And we don't really even know what this function might have had. But we have them in several of the sites that have been excavated. So clearly, hopefully someday we'll find some evidence that will help us interpret that. And here's just an example at another site at Tepe where modern experimental archaeology built one of these huts. It's a smaller one. It's a residential hut rather than a meeting space hut, but it gives you a sense of the idea. And using all of the local materials. So in the thatch here is a mixture of branches and reeds and grasses and stuff like that. So we also have religious sites, quite a few of them. Last count I saw was around 300 plus religious sites. Unfortunately, I could not find a distribution map that showed where they are around the island. They are clustered largely toward the western side, but that is not definitive. We always have to remember when we're talking about archaeology that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Because as I mentioned, a lot of this stuff was dismantled in the 19th century, and we have no idea how much of the stuff from this Bronze Age culture would have been subsequently dismantled in the classical period when the Romans controlled it, or the period before that when it was under the control of the Punic culture out of North Africa, of Carthage. So we just never know. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Anyway, so here is one of the few entire nuragic sanctuaries that we have at Santa Cristina. And I've included an aerial photograph here to give you a sense of some of the components of it. And the most notable feature is this large oval in the center of the photograph. And that is what you're looking at in the photograph on the right-hand side. It's the entrance down into one of the types of temples that the Nuragic culture created. These are the earlier temples, we believe, and that they are the hypogeum temples, a fancy word for underground temples. And that seems to have been the typical style for the early Nuragic culture, and possibly coming out of that Bonanaro culture that preceded it, and some of those other cultures that also fed into the development of the Nuragic civilization. And then we have the bulk of the temples that we have preserved today are later. They are 1,400, 1,300 BC range down to like 1,000 generally. They are what we call megaron temples. And this is a Mycenaean Greek structure. They first appear in Mycenae in the Peloponnesus on mainland Greece in the late 15th century BC, so the 1400s. And we start to see them relatively soon over the course of the next century appearing in the Nuragic culture. And there's a lot of interaction. We see influence between the Mycenaeans and the Nuragic culture in their pottery, in their architecture, some of the metalworking even. But yeah, they clearly adopted this very simple, constructed by stone boulders or ashlar, megaron temples. And megarons are characterized by these long central axes leading into multiple chambers, where the Holy of Holies would be at the most remote of the chambers. And we have these, I think somewhere in a ballpark of like 100 and 150 of the temples that have been documented, many of which are no longer visible. They're either buried or they were dismantled after they were documented. So yeah, it's kind of rare to find them today. All right, then we have a whole series of religious sites that are specifically tied to water. Water was clearly a important religious characteristic in the Nuragic culture. You can see from another one of these plans I've included on the right. Look, these are top plans and sections looking down. And so up here is the looking down on the top, and this is the section looking in from the side. So each two rows are representing a particular monuments rather, three monuments to a column. And the one that I have the best photographs for is this one down here at the very bottom at a site of Tempiesu. And it's this gorgeous ashlar constructed pyramid-like building that's been destroyed on the top with these relieving arches supporting the weight at the top. And down here is where the spring is. And I've included a small inset photograph of the spring. And it would be accessed through this little door. There's also a little windows, probably just to let light in. This all would have been covered in antiquity. So this part that you're seeing here of the internal triangle would not have been exposed at the time it was functioning. Now, who did they worship at these temples and at these water sites? Again, we don't know. We don't know anything about the theology or the pantheon of deities. We can posit based on some educated guesses, if you will, or shall we say informed guesses. I mean, that we have evidence of a great mother. We have evidence of a water deity or deities. There was a sky god warrior figure, most likely, based on some of the imagery we see in statuettes and the bronze work and the stonework. Again, typical for the time, typical for the region, so we can assume that there are similarities to other Bronze Age cultures for whom we have better documentation. A lot of these Bronze Age cultures, we have to remember, even the Mycenaeans, we have texts, but we can't read a lot of them. Linear A, Linear B, all of those sort of things that you may have heard about. But in the case of the Nuragic people, we don't even seem to have writing at the point that these buildings are being built. So we have some exquisite pottery, and the pottery is very much indicative that this culture had, from its very inception, had very strong ties with all the other cultures around these islands, and all the way over to the Aegean. So we have Minoan influence, we have Cycladic influence. Both of those are, of course, on the other side of the Italian boot, on the other side of the Greek peninsulas, of the Balkan Peninsula. We have influence coming from the Bronze and Iron Age cultures of the Italian peninsula as well. So we have some Etruscan stuff going on, some of the other Latin tribes. There's even indications that some of the Bronze Age European cultures were involved with the Nuragic culture on Sardinia, most notably the Bell Beaker culture I mentioned. So We see a lot of this in their pottery, and I could show you dozens and dozens, but I've chosen only about a half a dozen images. So on the left here is an early example of stamped ceramic. This was very characteristic of the Nuragic culture in some of its earlier phases. They like to use, they would just mold the vessel or throw it on a wheel and then stamp it with all these different patterns. We have this lovely, elegant ascos, these are small vessels that are used to pour liquids when you need a smaller amount of liquid. So they're often used, say, for filling oil lamps, or maybe if they were drinking a cordial versus wine or something, they might serve it in an ascos. And this beautiful one on the right-hand side of the screen, it has a little bit of the proto-geometric etching that is not specifically characteristic of Nuragic. We find it throughout the region, going back to the Bell Beaker culture. But like all cultures, they use it in their own way. So that makes it identifiably their cultural item, as opposed to an import from another culture that was using geometric decorations that were etched into the clay. Here's a couple of other items. On the left is an early Iron Age brazier, and it's a marvelous little vessel where the fire would have been built in that lower part, and then another vessel would have been set on that small little podium at the top here. So who knows what they were using this for, but I always like to think of it as some sort of elaborate scent dispenser. No, it clearly had something more practical in mind, I'm sure. On the right-hand side is another example of this etched pottery, but this is gorgeous with these 4 lug handles on the 2 sides. Not particularly practical for handling, so it's been suggested these may have actually been to support some sort of suspension, like a ropes or something that would have suspended it, or it could have just been for holding in 2 hands. But here again, you see the etching along the sides, and now we're starting to move into more clearly geometric designs. And then the last 2 pots I'm going to show you, but 2 of my favorites, is this beautiful double jug with this female figure surmounting between the 2 mouths, necks of the vessels. This particular one is definitely Nuragic, but it was actually found in Tuscany at Vitellonia. So we don't have any context about where it was made, or we're not even 100% sure what time period it is, but clearly material that was being produced by these people on the island of Sardinia was being exported. Geometric vase with a fake spout right here is our last pot, with the 2 lug handles and the wide mouth, and a very classic Eastern Mediterranean geometric patterning all around the vessels. This is when you've gone from just using a few random elements in the proto-geometric to solidly covering the vessel in different geometric patterns. So these are very much in the 1200 BC down to 800 even. It's hard to pin down because a lot of these patterns stay in use for a very long time. But the other thing that the Nuragic culture was known for were these really spectacular stone sculptures and stone items. I only have a few to show you because, as always, I have more material than I can cover in an hour. So I've chosen a few examples to show you. These are 8th century BC, so that's Iron Age, and they're giant statues. These statues were 2 to 2.5 meters in height, found at Monte Parama, and we call them the Monte Parama giants. There's about 40 of them that were found in somewhere around 5,700 pieces. And then people spent decades piecing together the broken stone fragments to begin to get a sense of how many there were. And it's debated whether it's 37, 38, or 40, but let's call it an even 40 for the sake of ease. But they're all images of sportsmen and warriors. So there are warriors. This large one here is a boxer, And that's the same one that's shown here in this grouping. Here's another boxer. This one they both probably had the same pose, one arm up and one arm out in a pugilistic stance. The other two are possibly wrestlers, possibly boxers as well. We don't have enough detail on all of the statues to fully say what each and every one was, but they were all monumental images of these sportsmen, warriors and sportsmen. That's kind of cool. I'm a big fan of the eyes and the deep cut eye sockets, the very linear nose here, and these incredibly big, gaping eyes. What I find fascinating about this is if you took the eyes away and forgot everything else, you've got a very strong Cycladic influence going on here. Like this nose and these eyebrow ridges and the shape of the face. If you took the other details away, you could easily see this as being from the earlier Cycladic culture over in the Aegean. They also did a wide range of little model sculptures. And here are two examples where they carved examples of these nuraghe towers. This one here even has little holes drilled around where it's thought to maybe had little flags or banners put in it if those were in use. Maybe they were for some sort of structure that was involved in protecting in the time of warfare. We don't honestly know, but it's an interesting example. Not only did they carve the model, but they then modified it and adapted it to be even more representative. Over here's another nuragic model, but this one's got a human figure reaching up. Some say the person's holding a torch. Others say it's a spear or something, but to be honest, it's so broken and eroded that I don't think we can ever say what the figure is doing. But the figure is actually wearing what appears to be a harness, suggesting that it might be an image of a warrior that's attacking the tower. But again, pure hypothetical speculation. And then I'm going to end today with what I think are really the Nuragic gemstones. I'm going to show you a few examples of some of their bronze work. They weren't the first in the region, obviously, to do bronze statues or even very complex bronze statues. But when they did adopt it in the early part of the first millennium BC, I don't think we have anything that dates before 800, maybe 850, 900 BC. Bronze is notoriously hard to date, so unless it's found in a context that you can date it, we don't always know. And so typical of material from this part of the world, from these time periods, a lot of this stuff also is in collections, and we don't know where it originally came from. So yeah, a lot of speculation on this stuff. But when they did adopt bronze working and started making sculptures, they mastered the art of the lost wax molds, and you just see some incredible details on these statues. So of course, when I say lost wax, these would have been the case where they would have carved the image originally in wax, and then they would build a clay mold around that wax, leaving a hole for the molten metal to be poured into. The molten metal would be poured into the hole of the mold. The wax would evaporate and burn away from the molten metal, and then the metal would take the shape of what the mold created around the original wax sculpture. And that's how these were being created. And just look at this beautiful draping of this cape on this woman with child, or with the way the arm on this figure reaches around to hold the horns of the bull. I mean, just fascinating stuff. And then, of course, I had to include this little model of a nuraghe itself that was excavated, and we do know that it dates to between the 7th and 6th century BCE. And that is all I have for you today. I'm going to end leaving with this one picture of another one of the giant tomb entrances. So thank you very much for your time and your attention today. I hope you got a sense of the extent and gloriousness of this Nuragic civilization.
Thank you, Christopher.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Really fascinating. I don't know if anyone has any questions they would like to ask Chris.
Look, thank you. That was very interesting. I don't know anything about that period of history. The boxes reminded me of a bit of the frescoes from Santorini, and obviously there probably would have been some contact between Minoans and Sardinians and all those sort of people. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, you're suggesting that they spanned the Bronze Age collapse. And I read somewhere that they might have actually been the sea people, the famous sea people who were partially responsible, allegedly, for the Bronze Age collapse. So do you have any information on that? And one more question, if I may. I was wondering if they left anything in writing.
To be fair, we still don't know who the sea peoples were. So we don't know whether it was a singular people, whether it was waves of different peoples, whether it was a coalition of different peoples, and maybe the Nuragic people were part of that. So it's one of those questions that for the moment we have no evidence anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean to yet tell us who the sea peoples were. So I'm on board with the possibility that the Nuragic culture. The one thing that I would say is we don't seem to see in the material culture of the Nuragic civilization, we don't see the rapid decline and collapse in the same way that we do further to the east. So they may have actually weathered that. Bear in mind, Sardinia is separated from the Aegean by both the Peloponnesus and then the Italian boot, and then you have the islands. So it's much closer to Western Europe than it is to the Aegean. So it's not to say that they couldn't have been the people, part of the sea peoples, but we don't really see the evidence of the economic collapse that we found in the Middle Bronze Age elsewhere. So I don't know if that answers your question, Tony.
I don't know that anyone knows those sorts of things.
We don't.
The other part of the question was about the Hittites, who were pre-Bronze Age collapse, left a whole lot of material in writing, archives. Are there any archives or any of that? Do we know how they wrote, what sort of script they used or anything like that?
They clearly had their own language, and linguists argue that there's elements of it still in the Sardinian language. Obviously, when you go to Sardinia today, mostly it's Italian that's being spoken, but amongst the more remote communities, there's still an indigenous language, and it actually shares similarity with Basque more than other Latin-derived languages. So I honestly, I didn't really refresh myself on the linguistic aspect of it. But no, we don't have the writing. The holy grail of so many of these ancient cultures is to find some. No, a lot of what we know is like all of these other cultures from the time period in both sides of the Italian peninsula. We have what the Romans and the Greeks said about them, and we have the archaeology, and that's largely what we have to work with.
Christopher, can you explain to everyone how many of these amazing things that you've been showing us in pictures are actually included in the tour?
Yes, most of the nuraghe that I've shown are on the tour. We do see that water feature at Temiasu, and a lot of the artifacts, many more artifacts, we will see in several of the museums.
Monitor us, what happened to them and when?
Let's see, they did not suffer a catastrophic ending like other cultures did. They were absorbed into the Roman world. They had already been moving away from their distinctive identity for half a millennia before that. And that was in 238 is when Rome captured both Corsica and 238 BC. That's part of the Punic Wars, because Carthage had been controlling the islands off and on for about a century and a half, before the Romans come in and really just absorb them. I mentioned along the way how we saw Cycladic influence, we saw Minoan influence, we saw Mycenaean influence, and then along comes the Phoenician and the Punic variant of the Phoenician. And so all of these were constantly coming in to affect the culture. And they'd really just get absorbed into the Roman world. Clearly, the communities must have kept some of their language, their own language, some of their pottery and metalwork that we can identify as nuragic is still being produced in the Roman Republic period after the end of the Carthaginian Wars, the Punic Wars. So yeah, there's cultural elements are being preserved. What I always like to say when I'm touring different parts of the world with people is governments change, the people don't. So the Romans come in, they take over, and now we've got Roman institutions, we've got Roman laws, we've got Roman religions coming in. But that doesn't mean that everybody on the street, his lives are radically changed. They're cooking the same foods, they continue to make their own pots. The new culture might bring in new styles that they like, and then they adapt and they absorb those. And oftentimes you end up with interesting amalgamations that one can still say is nuragic. I always loved when I do my Jordan tours, because of course you probably all know that Nabateans are my thing. The Nabatean painted fineware pottery is a perfect example of this. It's eggshell thin, it's gorgeous painted, it's unique to the Nabateans, and yet it has elements from all these other cultures that they interacted with because they were traders. So when I take people around Petra, I like to point out, it's the same thing that we'll do in Sardinia as well. You see this structure? Okay, this piece you could find in Alexandria. This piece you could find in Mycenae. This piece, you could find this amongst the Hittites. So there's an amalgamation going on. So they didn't end in a catastrophe like some of the Middle Bronze Age cultures as Tony was mentioning, but rather they get absorbed into Rome.
Thank you once again, Christopher, for a really fascinating lecture. It was fabulous.
Thank you.